Thank you all very much for coming, for interest in the topic of the inmates physicians I'm going to deal with today. Just one note on this photo here. This is a propaganda photo by the SS from Sachsenhausen concentration camp. You cannot imagine medical care in the concentration camp in the way it's displayed there, not at all. Inmate physicians were doctors who were deported to concentration camps and were assigned to work in the medical facilities there. These inmate physicians belonged to the class of the inmates officials, which the SS put in duty to organize camp operations. The SS somehow eased itself the work in the camps by employing inmate officials. Inmate physicians had to work in blocks that were rife with infectious disease, but on the other hand, they were, like other inmate officials, granted somewhat greater freedom of action, and they were granted privileges that helped them to survive. Still, they were in a very difficult position. They had to maintain a constant balancing between the commands of the SS and the interests of their patients. In any event, their medical efforts for inmates suffering from hunger and the effects of forced labors were being misused by the SS, who wanted to keep up exploiting the work for prisoners for economic gain. Inmates whose capacity to work was exhausted were selected to death, and prisoners' physicians did also have to take part in this. All in all, they were faced with a profound moral dilemma regarding their duties in the camp. How did inmate physicians deal with the fact that ultimately they could not serve as doctors in the camp without violating humanitarian principles and standards of medical ethics? Did they refuse to participate in selections or even experiments? If not, how did they later justify their actions? Another question is, physicians from the various inmates groups, like Jews, non-Jews, like physicians registered as Germans, as Poles, as Russians, they occupied quite different positions in the SS-made camp hierarchy. Did members of these different groups behave differently in the gray zone between collaboration and resistance? These are the questions I'm going to address today. In the first part of my presentation, I want to focus on the position of the inmate officials and how this affected the work of the doctors. Inmate officials in general, not the doctors, only the doctors, all the inmate officials formed an intermediate group, an intermediate class between the SS camp staff and the majority of the prisoners. The SS had divided the prisoners' community into different groups in order to exercise control over them. The different groups were defined by the reasons for imprisonment, for example, political prisoner, criminal, Jew, or by the nationality, German, Pole, Russian, French. And from this, something like an inmate hierarchy resulted, and this hierarchy clearly reflected the racist worldview of the SS. On the very top, of course, there were the German non-Jewish prisoners, followed by prisoners from the Western European countries, then prisoners from Southern European, Eastern European, the Soviets, and the very lowest rank was given to the Jewish prisoners. Jewish prisoners were put in this very lowest rank. Also, the system of these inmate officials somehow served to strengthen the SS control. to secure the loyalty of these inmate officials, the SS granted them privileges. And these privileges could be taken away, revoked from them if they misbehaved, if they didn't act like the SS expected this. And this made them dependent on the SS. Inmate physicians were given more nutritious food. They slept for the most part in separate rooms. They had better clothing, and they were relieved from the hard physical labor other inmates had to perform in every weather conditions outside in the camp. In addition to this very tangible advantages, I'm sorry, this was, but the next is to come anyway. Inmate officials were given some kind of power over other inmates. It was therefore not uncommon, as the former Polish inmate physician Stanislaw Kloczynski later recounted, that inmates took on duties for, as Kloczynski wrote, egoistical reasons in order to save their own lives. However, so Kloczynski added, inmates who took that step allowed themselves to be subsumed, and again citation, to be subsumed into the machinery of death, making it the SS easier to kill their comrades. And Jewish concentration camp survivor H.G. Adler pointed to the same problem when he characterized inmate officials as the long arm of the SS. Inmate officials had better survival chances, but they were faced from the start with a dilemma. It was not possible in the concentration camp for inmate officials to perform their duties solely and not even primarily to the benefit of their fellow inmates, as inmates officials received their orders from the SS. Inmate officials concerned with the well-being of their fellow inmates therefore had to walk a fine line between obedience to the SS and the solidarity with their comrades and their patients. Generally, however, the opportunities in the camp to help were by far outweighed by the obligation to take part in SS actions. And what is more, actions that benefited some inmates always had negative consequences for others. But in spite of all this problematics in their position at all, these inmate official positions they opened a greater scope for action and therefore were the only chance for resistance in the camp. And despite the role of these inmate physicians being a problematic one, basically, inmate officials effected improvement for many prisoners and in fact saved many lives in the concentration camp. Now, the second point I'm going to look at is the question dealing with coercion, meaning inmates officials, the duties and the conflicts they faced. Like these inmate officials, generally, inmate physicians were granted privileges that the majority of the prisoners were not. This made the infirmary, despite of all danger and illnesses that prevailed there, a desirable workplace. However, as the former political prisoner Hermann Langbein recounted, and you see it here on the slide, serving in the infirmary was fundamentally different from the work in almost any other detail. Usually, you worked so as not to draw attention to yourself, so you would not be punished. The infirmary staff, though, were driven by their conscience to act in the interest of their fellow inmates who were sick, and that put a burden of responsibility on each of the nurses and doctors that was often more than any person could be expected to bear. And making this burden even greater was the fact that moral guidelines were often unusual in the conditions created by the SS camp rule, like as the former Austrian inmate physician Ella Lingens recounted. Another quote, "It is really true that you could not be guided by normal principles of humanitarian ethics because you were confronted with problems that had never existed before and that you were powerless against." Ultimately, almost any medical treatment in the concentration camp was linked to selection. The first question to be answered was always who could receive treatment. Who among the many sick people could benefit from the scarce medicines available, who could receive one of the few infirmary beds, who should be assigned additional food, and who should not. Permanent shortages in the camp made it impossible for the inmate physicians to give all the sick inmates the medical treatment they required, and forced the doctors to decide how the meager resources available should be allocated. Actions taken under these circumstances necessarily contradict the standards of medical ethics. Inmate physicians felt the situation to be a terrible dilemma, as the French inmate physician Robert Weiss recounted. Again, a citation, "You could only help a limited number of people, and you were forced to act as judge and jury. Making this choice is one of the most difficult problems that any doctor worthy the name can be faced with." Participating in sorting out the incurable was another responsibility abhorrent to the principles of medical ethics. Although the decision to grant or to deny treatment was often a decision on life or death, the actual selections put a particular burden on the inmate physicians. Starting in 1942, at the latest, the SS regularly ordered selections to reduce the number of infirmary patients who were unfit to work. Those who were selected were either left to die or killed. Although the decision-making authority and therefore the responsibility in the selections lay clearly with the SS doctors, inmate physicians were also confronted with these selections, for example, when they, in their capacity as ward doctors, were ordered to assist in a selection or had to draw up some kind of list, doing a pre-selection, a list of possible selection candidates. Finally, a particular problem was the order to assist at the criminal human experiments that were undertaken in great numbers by German doctors in the concentration camps. Inmate physicians who were involved in these experiments were typically only assigned with preparatory or follow-up tasks that did not force them to directly physically harm the test subjects themselves. But in some cases, doctors were also forced to take part in experiments which forced them to put harm to the test subject. And one of these prisoners was the Polish surgeon Václav Dering we have been hearing about already yesterday. An interesting source in this connection are the transcriptions from the Dering versus Uris trial in London in 1964. And I was recently able to consult these transcripts at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas. This London trial was a libel action filed against by the Václav Dering, filed against the writer Leon Uris. The cause was a passage in Uris' 1958 published novel Exodus, saying that Dering had performed 17,000 experimental operations at Auschwitz concentration camps without anesthetics. Therefore, the Dering versus Uris trial mainly focused on the question of the human experimentation and on the question whether inmate physicians had to take part in it or not. This Dering versus Juris trial indeed dealt with an extreme example of collaboration by an inmate physician with the Nazi perpetrators. The Polish doctor Wacław Dering had to surgically remove ovaries and testicles from Jewish men and women and men in Auschwitz for histopathological examination. He acted on behalf of the German Nazi Dr. Horst Schumann, who had destroyed the victims' reproductive organs beforehand by irradiation for purpose of sterilization. And during the trial, Juris lawyers were able to prove that Dering had performed at least 130 such operations in connection with Schumann's X-ray mass sterilization experiments in 1943-1944. Now, the trial transcripts that I saw clearly show the participation in these experiments could in fact be avoided by the inmate physicians. However, for Jewish and non-Jewish inmate physicians, different conditions prevailed. Non-Jews, like the French psychiatrist Madeleine Ottwal, who, being a Western European, held a relatively high position in the SS-made camp hierarchy, Madeleine Ottwal could just directly say no, and, as it turned out, did not have to bear any consequences. I cite from the transcripts, after refusing to assist in the experiment, Ottwal was called on Chief SS Dr. Eduard Wirz, and he asked me, citation, whether it was true that I had refused both the operation and to give the anesthetics, and I said it was true. He asked me why, and I answered him that it was contrary to my conceptions of a doctor. What happened then? I remained in the block as a doctor. For Jewish inmate Dr. Dorota Kleinowa-Lorska von Warschau, the circumstances were different. Asked in the court whether refusing to obey a direct Nazi order in the camp would for her also have remained without consequences, she said, citation, "My situation would have been worse because I am Jewish." She would have been transferred to some heavy labor commando with hard physical work, and she would have lost her privileges as an inmate doctor, which helped her to survive. But, as Lorska pointed out, even without refusing directly, citation, one could always bypass the orders of the SS in such a way as to avoid punishment and not to carry out the orders at the same time. Kleinowa-Lorska's medical colleague in the camp, the Polish Jewess Alina Brewda, for example, avoided being enlisted in Schumann's experiments by falsely claiming that she had no surgical experience whatsoever. She couldn't do it. And Kleinowa-Lorska herself volunteered for working in an SS laboratory in order not to be asked to participate in the experiments. The non-Jewish inmates Wacław Dering and Jan Grablinski, in contrast, were willing to collaborate. The two Polish physicians surgically castrated a huge number of test subjects in connection with Schumann's experiments, taking turns in acting as surgeon and assistant during the operations. Later in court, Dering gave two reasons for his actions. On the one hand, Dering claimed he had just wanted to achieve a lesser evil for the experiment victims. If he and Grabczynski, two well-trained and experienced surgeons, had not done it, so he said, the operations would have been performed by an unskilled German doctor or orderly. If not, again Dering, something even more horrible would have happened, namely the test persons would have been sent to the gas chamber in order to remove the organs Schumann wanted after death. So, for the sake, this is again a citation, for the sake of those who were to be operated on, it would have been a much lesser risk, said Schumann, to be operated by the Polish doctors than in the end. On the other hand, Dering argued with the fear of being punished. Citation, if we refused to carry out these operations, it was probable that some or all of us would have been sent to the gas chambers ourselves. Dering was exaggerating. Sure, Dering in fact had to expect a punishment when directly refusing to obey an order by the SS, because as a Pole, unlike Madeleine Hotwall, he held a relatively lower position in the, I'm nearly done, in the SS camp hierarchy. However, as a non-Jew, Dering had to expect far less serious consequences than, for example, his Jewish colleague Kleinova-Lorska. As Dering, in fact, mentioned in the court, he had directly refused an SS order in Auschwitz before the experiment started. At that time, he was asked by the SS doctor to kill a sick patient by a phenol injection, and he said, I will not do it. And for this, Dering, as it turned out in court, Dering had been deprived of his weekly half a day off for a certain period. Not a too severe punishment after all. Still, Dering was afraid that he might lose his position as an inmate doctor in case of a second refusal. And this turned out, he signified it rather indirectly in the trial by saying, citation, I had also in mind my overall responsibility for my fellow prisoners. I was one of the two only experienced surgeons in the camp, and I had to give consideration to the amount of general suffering which I could relieve by my work, meaning he did so much good thing in this position, and so it was for the benefit of all if he stayed in this position. Now, in the beginning of my paper, I wanted to make you aware that working in the infirmary didn't only mean a great responsibility, but also meant privileges that you didn't, that Dering was about to lose if he refused. At least he feared so. And another fact, Dering and Grabczynski both, when you look at the history, they were released from Auschwitz concentration camp in 1944, and not very many prisoners, in fact, were released from Auschwitz ever. And I guess that their willing collaboration had most probably been a major reason for this. Thank you very much.